like to preface this video by saying that, as far as I'm aware, I've never been a catcaller. In fact, I've never been exactly the kind of fellow who would live any kind of promiscuous life. In fact, if you read my blog, which may be related to this YouTube video, this is just all for ethos, by the way, which I think is kind of an evil appeal, but it might as well be useful as a starting point. My earliest entries in my blog were actually kind of expressions of moral indignation at some of the sexual attitudes of some of my peers. Now, since then, since I've matured and actually been around people more, had a greater diversity of experience, a greater cultural development, greater social development, I've actually come to see that, maybe this thing isn't quite as black and white as I thought when I was younger in my moral development. Um, that being said, uh, like I said, I don't think I've ever been accused of catcalling anyone, but I'm not entirely sure this is a very precise term, um, because really, for me, the term itself falls flat because it's so ambiguous. There are so many things which could fall under its category. Um, a little bit more background. For a while, I didn't really have a social group. I was very much a loner growing up. And while I was going to college in the San Marcos area of California, I would tend to drift around a lot, kind of living a Zen life, and meeting random people, sometimes on public transit, and having experiences talking to them, learning about things way outside of my social group, out of my comfort zone. And always, what this did was it was a double-edged sword because on the one hand, I knew a lot of people ultimately, and I knew a lot of perspectives. I was very well informed through my kind of social deviance, you might say. Um, on the other hand, I never had a group mentality. And so when I'd be in a group and I'd say some things which seemed like common sense to me, people were offended by it because they'd kind of ridden the kind of forces of social, if you take a sociology class, like socialization, they had a way of seeing the world which was their in-group, and they presumed that other groups saw it much the same way. When you really get down to it, people are very, very diverse in how they perceive the world, but our media makes it seem as though we're all the same. And it's only someone who's actually been kind of around the block and talked to a diverse crowd of people that would really, I think, really know for a fact that, people are very different. And you'd also get this way of actually perceiving, like, pretty much with human behavior, anything's possible. You'll find someone who's into almost anything. Now, with that segue, let's go into the hot topic today of catcalling. And I'm going to try to the best of my ability, to be an objective third party here, using chiefly logic and separating myself from my own emotions to the best degree that's possible. And obviously you can make absolutistic, sophist statements, well, you can't ever do that fully, but those could go on forever, and why should they? Um, the thing about it is, in matters, a lot of people, I think, have the naive notion that there are some matters which are controversial, which are topics of dispute, and some which are just go without question. And usually that's what worries me, because the people who speak entirely in statements, the people who parrot what they've read or what they've heard through social media or something like that, who take this just to be an absolute fact, those are the people who are perpetuating a kind of dogma, a kind of propaganda, in effect, as I'll go into, a kind of totalitarian thinking. And even if you're right, you should be able to warrant whatever they have to say. Because in actually figuring out, well, why you feel intuitively something to be wrong, you can actually use that same reasoning in other aspects of your life as well, to be morally consistent, and maybe help to improve further on. Now, one of the reasons that you don't usually use Google when answering a problem is when I do a search on something, no matter what my search query is, if it's a hot topic, the first 10 results are all going to have one view on the topic. Like, whenever you hear, for instance, or you read that, like, Democrats and Republicans both agree on so and so and so and so, you can bet that you're being manipulated, like, and you can bet that this agreement was in some way staged. Because the fact of the matter is, and many people won't want to hear this, but there are powers that be in this society There are people in this society as much as in any other one that want to control you. There are, and these are the true patriarchal forces of society by definition. As Marion Woodman said, um, basically, like, uh, what patriarchy really is someone being controlling, and that could be anyone. That could be a man, that could be a woman, that could be someone of any kind of skin color, of course. Why would it matter? And anyone who, and it could be a group of people as well, possessed of a notion which seems good, but really is very dubious. Now, what is catcalling, therefore, in its widest sense? Well, in a very specific sense, to start off, it's become very much vilified by our society, and anyone who studied the history of propaganda knows how this works. Myself personally, my family came from the Soviet Union. I'm very well aware of what demonization is. You exaggerate aspects of a situation which are maybe perceived um, negatively, subjectively, and you make it appear that like the situation's always that way, and whenever it appears that way to you, like you think you're being objective, like relatively objective, like you feel yourself to be a victim of something because it's not socially accepted. But very rarely, therefore, do we actually question why it's not socially accepted and what mechanism is at work underlying this. And this is part of a bigger issue outside of just the notion of catcalling by itself. Um, you know, people use a lot of circular reasoning. They say, catcalling is just wrong or it's just abrasive or whatever. Always, these absolute statements. You ask, well, why is it that? Well, it's because it's offensive. It's kind of a circular reasoning. Why is it offensive? It's because it's bad. No one actually gets out of this moralizing and this evaluative thing. Actually gets into like objectively, like relatively objectively, why it would be bad. So why no, I know there's enough stigma against it. I don't need to actually address why it's bad or something. I'm not that political that I'd have to show you both sides of an issue. I don't think that most things actually have two sides to them. I think that it's just a matter of informed opinions versus uninformed opinions, and my hope is, because I'm an optimistic fellow, that sooner or later the informed opinions will rise to the top and break through the crust of uninformed opinions. In the broad sense, I think that what catcalling is it's approaching strangers. And take an extreme example of someone who claims not to like catcalling, the Huffington Post. Huffington Post loves to talk in absolutes, and it should strike everyone as being a form of pretty much propaganda. I mean, responsible adults should be able to make moral decisions without a big brother figure dictating what's right or wrong. Well, gee, I mean, you could put forth a discussion about what is ethical and what has been agreed upon as ethical, and theoretically, in a situation, if I'm a competent moral reasoner, I'd be able to work out all this in my mind before making a decision, or after making a decision if I'm in one of those situations, or if I'm of that mindset that you should act first and think later, which is actually, it can be a good point for it. I'm not going to go into that. In fact, there have been incredible points made in context of that actually being a more responsible way of living life. But right now, let's just presume that, much like in this video, we rationalize first and then we act. The thing about it is, there's something infantile in people that doesn't want to do that, that doesn't actually want to go through the work of thinking through an action and how it applies to you and what it says about you. And so what you do is you just allow the big brother figure to tell you what's right and wrong. And this has been done throughout the course of human history, at least since the establishment of agrarian society and actually since the establishment of patriarchy. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the film, the Richard Linklater film. I think it's Before Sunset. But essentially the whole premise of this film is this guy approaches this woman randomly on a train and asks if she wants to talk. Now, it's quite obvious he's attracted to her. But something beautiful unfolds from that. It's very romantic. It's also very, very intelligent. It's very, it shows like she makes a digression from her way of life, and and he makes a digression from his way of life, and it's not imbalanced in either way. Like you can tell this is actually based in like maybe some actual experience. This is just these two people basically talking, and both of them get like an equal voice, and by the end of it, it's just this beautiful. I'm not gonna spoil it. Just this beautiful film. Um, Now, there's something in the mind that says, well, okay, that's very beautiful, But that's very, very different from like someone approaching you and saying, "Hey, nice ass." Um, but really, is it? If you think about it, if you're really culturally informed, is it really? I mean, one of them is very romantic and the other is more direct. Um, but let's look at what the Huffington Post has to say. The Huffington Post says that there's never any circumstance under which you should approach a stranger. That doesn't terrify you. Let me continue. Um, it says that men should not approach women when women are just on their way to work or the way home from work. What kind of society are we living in? Let's think about that for a moment. I had this job with a number of people, um, predominantly women, but that's not really relevant. That's just kind of my background, saying I've been around women. I've kind of had the opportunity to learn in what ways women are actually the company of women is actually very different from the company I've met. Just from practical experience, not just from abstract extrapolation or ideology, just from what I've experienced. In many ways, though, fundamentally, connected, not not estranged, but everything in life that you love, everything in life that you're interested in is different from you, is other than you, and one thing that should really strike people as being incredibly dubious is when we take our cultural lack of otherness and actually pride in ourselves in that and say that seeing something as other than you is actually bad, as otherization. And my view on this is the same as that of Alan Watts. To love someone is actually love that someone as an other. Bertrand Russell said something very similar. Um, when you subsume something to the self and try to ignore like the way that the world around you is different from you, it could be the material world, it could be other people. You've really just it's narcissistic. That's a power attitude. Because what you're interacting with is not actually the world. You're interacting with your symbols of the world, and you use those symbols to keep track of them in your mind so that you can control them. So that might be a bit metaphysical, but that's more or less, I think, a fact. I don't see any reason to question it. And ideology always tries to assume everyone to a common self. Love actually tries to break out of that. As Marie-Louise von Franz, the Jungian analyst, said, what we're really lacking in our society is eros. It's love. It's this notion of something which isn't necessarily selfless, but it's something personal between two people, beautifully exemplified in that film I mentioned earlier, Before Sunrise. And it's humane, it's loving, and the way that Marie-Louise von Franz put it is like something uniquely human between one person and another. No one says nowadays in our culture, you know, uh, I do this against the rules because I love so and so. No one says that. Because the rules are the rules. The machine spit them out that way, to quote her pretty directly, and that's it. Um, this this is what I see. Now, going back to my coworkers at Joint Fabrics, with all due respect to them, um, and maintaining their anonymity. This I wouldn't say this of everyone, but more or less I could generalize onto most of the people there, or everyone. I don't know. And basically, like these women. I'm just saying that incidentally because most of them were women. That's all. It's not saying anything about women's nature. Don't strawman me on that one, by the way. I'm just being specific, um, for like scientific rigor, so to speak. Um, they they would be very restless to get out of there. Like it's like from the moment that they got there, it's like all that they wanted to do is just to get through it all and get the money and get out. And I found this to be very confusing because I thought that we were there to actually do a good job, to actually enjoy our work, not to feel estranged from it, and to feel that we've done a good service to society. And then once we're there, when we move away from that, we think back on what we did and maybe meditate a bit on it and see what the world has to offer us. It's a state of human freedom, basically. But instead, what I learned was that there's this mentality in a number of people going from point A to point B, back to point B to point A, and sometimes to point C, but always intent upon some destination, always intent upon some utilitarian goal, some service, strictly functional service to society, always within the confines of your social group, and never really fully aware peripherally of what's around you. Always just aimed at what's ahead of you, and therefore never fully satisfied with what you do, and never. And I've observed this within myself at points in my life. I think I might venture a guess that it's quite similar. Um, that my experience has been similar. Never fully aware of what's going on. Um, just and never fully happy. Always kind of looking forward to the next moment, hoping that it will be better than this one. Kind of a state of hell, if you think about it. And I thought what we should do instead is actually always be present and not be worrying about the next moment, but actually pour everything into this moment in a Zen fashion. And one thing that's interesting is that what catcalling is, and this has been, or what approaching strangers is that it unifies people. It's an affirmation that, look, we might come from different social groups, but we're all part of one humanity. And also, everything that we do, we're always judging by appearances. We're never being really objective. And even if you might claim to know a person, having known that person for a while, you only know that person in a certain context. You only know a fraction of what that person is capable of. And to the degree that you use that knowledge to define that person, you've really restricted that person, what that person could be. Like, knowledge is, in a way, a form of control. It is a way of power. So, one way to break out of this, to break out of being biased, to break out of being excessively socially conditioned, and to break into, actually a greater connectivity with human beings, a greater ambiguity, a greater danger in life, but in a good way, in a constructive way, and one that actually meets life, is to approach people. And sometimes approaching strangers and being honest about, that you're attracted to them. Now, you can always, like, reduce that. Um, I'll get that in a moment. You can always reduce that, in a reductionistic way to one of a series of explanations for why people do this. You could say it's uncultured or it's in your nature, but really none of those are really adequate. No one can actually prove them for certain. And no one can fairly generalize them onto all people. All these arguments are essentially circular because you presume at the very beginning that there is something out there as a hidden motive that's really there, whether you're conscious of it or not, whether it's and it's been socialized, and then you go out looking for it, and you claim to have found it, but really, like, you began with your logical inquiry with the presupposition that it was there, and that was never warranted. It's quite possible that oftentimes we're attracted to people, but this is a mysterious thing. This isn't a rational thing, but it should be celebrated because it leads us out of our comfort zone to ways of experiencing things we've never expected. And I can vouch to this again from personal experience. But what we have in our society is a lot of stranger danger, and it's very dangerous in fact, because anyone who wants to control people will always keep them separate. This is a number of people are very keenly aware of this, especially if they've grown up in, like, societies which were, like, somewhat oppressive. But people in America are very naive about this. Like, they'll go along with some propaganda that the Huffington Post puts forth or something, and they won't realize, like, they're being manipulated. Like, you could go into McDonald's with a television and see a bunch of people all looking up at the TV, but not one person's actually debating what's actually being talked about, at least, or very rarely, very rarely. And if you try to approach someone and try to talk to them about the news, it's like, oh no, they're getting the news from that source, rather than actually discussing it critically. That's not something to be proud of as a society. That is us being manipulated. That's actually very hypocritical because you're using your freedom to actually, which you do have, to restrict your own freedom, therefore to, by example, to restrict other people's freedom. Um, you can't be a competent moral reasoner that way. And there is a very good reason for why all this propaganda exists, and it's not that it's good or bad to catcall people, because some people may be receptive to it. Maybe a minority of people will be. Just like I'm a minority of people who would be, interested in that sort of thing. Maybe. Maybe a minority. But the thing is, and some people may be offended by it. You might be offended by it, And it doesn't matter which gender you are because it can happen both ways, really. You know, I've always been flattered when girls have like waved at me, but it happens so rarely. And one of my friends once joked at us, it's like, did we just get like raped or something? Because it's like, sorry, I know I use the R word, but it's like it's a joke because we live in such a ridiculously paranoid society. Like even that like might spook a guy out, and this guy that I was in the car with like has actually been very very active like sexually. Um, but this is just like, why do we interpret this as offensive? Why do we immediately distrust each other when that other person is just like the other half of you? I don't mean just like in gender. I mean like any case like that. That other person is a part of you. That's like common sense, right? That's the other. You're the self. That's why the otherness is important because that person is like you're totally dependent upon that person and interdependent. That's like what the African concept of Ubuntu is. It's like a Buddhist concept, Hindu concept. We're all connected. We're all essentially one. Uh, but not in like a hive mind way. Not like oh we all agree to this being good or bad. No, no. It's what we're doing is we're trying to connect with people. We're trying to break out. We're trying to make our lives the exploration of this mysterious series of possibilities to connect with each other courageously. And you might be offended by certain behavior, you might not like it. You have the right to say, hey, that's not me. And you might risk being confused with someone who would be into that, who would be into having like a romantic rendezvous from who's maybe from a different culture. Maybe I mean it seems like a peculiarly American thing that we don't like being approached by people. We're hostile, and that's where a lot of our social problems come from. But instead, we use those social problems to perpetuate the very dogmas that make us feel divided. And like I said, I'm not doing this for my benefit. I was never really that into like catcalling people or something like that. And I would understand that, some people may be very hostile, maybe not. But, I can't fairly judge them without knowing them. And it seems like really the most enlightened way of looking at this is that every problem's mutual. It's not a women's rights issue, it's not a men's rights issue, it's a human, it's not a rights issue. Like rights, what are rights? We have freedoms. When those freedoms are taken away, some state comes in and says, well, here are your rights. You don't have these freedoms, but you have these rights. And part of what's great about being human is not just being right, but being wrong. When we say someone has the right to be treated a certain way, what we're saying is it's right for people to behave in this way towards this person. But even if a person behaves wrongly, even if that person's a social deviant, I mean, there can be something good that comes out of it. An exercise of freedom, if it doesn't infringe upon someone's freedom, but just makes more choices available to that person, is not hypocritical. If you're restricting that person's freedom, if you're forcing someone into something, that's different. That's entirely different. But I mean, this idea